everybody, and
Lit.
welcome back to the Upstream podcast. I've got as guest today Kellan Elliot-McCrea from Adobe, but from a long list of prior Etsy, Flickr, all kinds of good stuff before that. And Adam Jacob, now the System Initiative, but probably most famous, I think the way you put it in a recent talk was, come on, you all know me from Chef. And
Does that sound
the
too egotistical? It's a little egotistical,
no,
right?
I mean,
Like
listen,
you
I was
shouldn't
in a
know me. That's not like a
I,
thing that should happen. Anyway,
well, I mean,
I mean, you
but let's
can know me.
actually.
I'm nice or whatever, but
Well, you don't bite too much, especially
yeah,
through a microphone. Well,
yeah.
I mean, one of the things that we can talk about today, what we want to talk about today is culture, tools, how openness threads through all that. One of the things that hadn't been on my agenda, but we should put a pin in it for later, is some of these cultures do create um, cultures where our rock stars are venerated in ways that maybe feels inappropriate, right?
Oh yeah.
But let's put a pin in that one
I
because I
got
want
I
to
got a
start.
whole thing about that. So
Oh, yeah. I mean, we should
pin
definitely
in
then
it.
try to make sure we have some time for it. But I want to start with this moment. Adam, you recently gave a talk where you talked about crisis-tunity, this idea that we're, especially in our field, there's a constant sense of crisis, but also therefore a constant uh, set of opportunities. And Kellan, you've been writing recently in a way that really resonated for me about, I don't know if you'd call it a crisis exactly, but you've been writing about how a
Yeah,
lot of us feel.
I think I would call it a crisis.
I would call
Would
it a
you?
crisis. Yeah.
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 Well, say a little bit about that.
Sure. And I left Dropbox last June and I had some time and I always kind of when I have some time, I like to go ask people a question. You know, it's I don't know, maybe it's my introverted nature or somehow other socially awkward, but having a project makes it easier for me to catch up with people. And the question that was haunting me a little bit was this sense that everybody thought their engineering team sucked. No one was impressed with how software was being built, and that was CEOs unimpressed with their software teams. It was senior engineers being unimpressed with their junior engineers. It was this sense of like, it's all gone to shit.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the field. That was the vibe. And digging in, it was really interesting to start pulling it apart because unsurprisingly, there was a lot of different stuff going on. But it was realizing that the stories we told ourselves about how software works and how software gets built had drifted. And not by accident, with a lot of pressure and input and money and, all sorts of things, but had drifted from the way it was actually being built. And that disconnect, that bifurcation, what we told ourselves and what we were doing was producing terrible results. I mean, terrible for the people, terrible for the businesses. I mean, just, everybody was miserable.
Totally.
And so starting to try to figure out kind of where the truth was in between those things. How do we bring what we are doing and what we are saying and what we are experiencing in line? And I do think it's a crisis, and I think it's partially a crisis because of what's going on in the economy. We've been called to account for that breakdown. We've taken, oh boy, the lights are turning off in here, but sorry. We've taken this problem that was made people feel bad, and then we've said actually this is a moral and business failing, and we will also fire you for it. So yeah, it's a crisis.
Yeah.
Adam, yeah, I mean, you've clearly got strong opinions on this. Go for it.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, I didn't come at it the same way Kellan did, obviously, but my observation is identical, I think, which is, there's always been this strain of when you go out and talk to people and help them build new things or help them try to change how they work or change the tooling that they use or any of those things, you always hear most of the time, we're the worst people in the world. Our environment is the worst environment that's ever existed. We're not good at any of these things. There is really this, and then there's a small number of people who have none of that. and probably have like an undeserved amount of pride in how great they are. I experienced this with Facebook really directly. Like you go talk, like when I went to the Facebook folks, they were like, no, we're great. We're the best. It's fine. We got it. and you were like, oh, okay, great. Well, I think, what if it was this way? And they're like, yep, good idea. We recognize that that's good because we're the best. And then you would go to like Citibank and they'd be like, you know, well, we are Citibank, so that's important and cool. And we're like, you know, proud of being Citibank, and it's complicated and you can't just understand Citibank in a day. And also like, we kind of hate it and we're not that impressed by it. and like, and we don't love it. And I think to me, one of the things that I see as an outcome of that is that our aspirations, the things we wanted to see from the changes that we made, the technologies that we built to try to achieve those aspirations have failed to actually deliver on what we aspired to. And it wasn't because our intentions were bad, but as an example of this, you know, like the DevOps movement is very much a piece of me and like of my heart. And the number one thing we wanted was developers and engineers working together to deliver software easily and quickly. And what we wound up with was teams of people writing infrastructure as code that the developers ignored because the infrastructure as code is huge and complicated and messy and they don't understand it. And infrastructure as code people who don't understand the application. And then maybe they hang out around CD pipelines wondering why they take an hour and a half. And like, I don't think that's what we wanted. You know, it's certainly not what we told people was going to happen, but it is what happened. And it is the outcome we're getting. And so we are dissatisfied with it sort of fundamentally because
sorry, go.
Right?
Absolutely. And it was funny, and you talking about, with the exception of Facebook, everyone feeling like we are the worst. And we talked a little bit at the, maybe as the pre-roll about the generational change. And like, that is one of the generational changes, because I remember a time, and it wasn't that long ago, when everybody was just like, tech is the shit. Our team is like, we are just amazing.
Yeah.
Everybody was really impressed with their software team. Again, probably undeservedly then, just as they are undeservedly or somewhat deservedly unhappy now.
But we were making it up then.
Yeah.
And that's the difference, right? Was that like when we had problems in the early internet, no one had solved them. Like, I remember building the first ISPs that were big enough, that had hundreds of thousands of users. And you couldn't buy a book and be like, how do I build an ISP with hundreds of thousands of users? Like, just how do I build a phone system that has 100,000 modems? Like, that just wasn't a thing. And we figured it out. And then it was like, how do I run, now there's people on the internet. How do I run a website that lets all the people show up all at once? And we're like, ooh, load balancers, you know, like of course we were impressed. Like, it was hard and we figured it out.
And the other interesting thing about that is our solutions were largely worse than the solutions today.
Yes.
But because we invented them, there were two interesting aspects of that. One, we knew how they worked inside and out. And two, because we had invented it, there was no one telling us we were doing it wrong. That we were not meeting some professional standard that was outside of yourself.
Yes. And yes.
Please,
yes.
No,
yes. 100%. And that, and at the same time, we were inventing the professional standard. Yeah. And so there were people who told us we were doing it wrong. I remember.
Oh yeah. I remember
one of the one of the ISPs that I worked for was owned by the power company in Arizona, weirdly enough. And it was because they had a private phone system that went to parts of Arizona that didn't have phones. And so we brought internet to places that didn't have phones, which is insane, but it's what happened. And like,
Adam, I'm confused. How are phones and the internet related to each other?
I know, right? Exactly. You can tell, you can't see me on the podcast, but I got a lot of gray in my beard, and there's a reason. And like, and I remember the guys who ran the NOC for the power company. And these are people who are responsible for, like, you know, nuclear power generation, the network being available, right? And they were pros and they were incredible at it. And they were like, you guys are doing it wrong. Everything about what we were doing, they were like, that's insane. Don't do that. And we were like, yeah, but we can't do what you do because it doesn't work for 100,000 people or 500,000 people. And they were like, yeah, I guess. And also still wrong.
Let me jump in there because I think I'm seeing sort of like there's like three things that I mean, so one, the expectations are just different, right? Like, as you know, Adam, as you're saying, like there was a transition from the people running the phone service for the nuclear power plants. I'm sure they had dozens of lines and thought that was like a big deal.
It was a big deal.
Right.
Still
right.
a big deal. Very hard.
But to do that for 100,000 or now, as we all internet scale, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think the second thing is that, hearing you two talk about, we solve these things for ourselves. There's a certain simplicity, right? When you are building it from scratch, an enforced simplicity of like, hey, we've only got so many people, so much time. And now, of course, we're all building on these castles. I mean, one of the things that jumped out at me about your essays, Kellan, was this notion of the complexity of not just what we're expected to do, but the complexity of the bottom up thing that we're managing. Hello World is 5,000 packages in any language that you want to talk about, right? And that the managing that level of complexity simultaneously empowers, but also I think both of you are pulling from different sides on the same string of like, we've made everything so complex that we are frustrated almost from go, right? Because it's a blessing and a curse, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm always nervous about talking about how complex we've made it. In that, like, it is.
I'm happy to talk about how complex we've made it, but I'll let you finish.
Yeah. In that, like, my best example for this is the Ford Model T. So if the three of us were locked in a room with all the parts required to construct a Ford Model T, and the rule was we couldn't leave until that car started, we would probably not die there. We would probably figure out how to do it. It was simple. Also, if you didn't know that when you turn the crank on a Ford Model T, that it often backfires, and so you need to make sure you don't grip the crank with your thumb, it will break your arm some very high percentage of the time. That was what the early internet was like. So was it simple? Yes. But do you want one? No, not really. Like I have an Audi in the garage and it has a little button and it says start, and you hit it and the car starts and you drive away. And that's much better. And in many ways,
but you'd never be able to build that from scratch.
But never ever. We would die if we tried to build it from scratch. But the Audi is simpler than the Ford Model T. Yeah. From the point of view of someone trying to do it, it's so much simpler. And then but the car itself, infinitely more complicated in terms of how it's put together and what all the pieces are. The price of that simplicity to the user is a high degree of complexity for the builder. And to me, I think the real challenge here isn't that we've added a bunch of unnecessary complication. I think in the most part, it was necessary to some degree. But more that we have forgotten to tell each other that we made it up. That there's so much of it now that there's too many people who look at that car and go, I could never build a car. What do you mean you would build a new operating system from scratch? That's insane. So complicated. And you're like, is it really? I know it seems complicated, but it's actually not that complicated. And it is hard. It's difficult. There's a lot of moving parts, but it is very doable. But if you went out and just surveyed people and were like, do you think you could build an operating system? They're like, no. And if you go back in time to when we were just randomly building the internet, the number of people who would have been like, well, okay, was pretty high because we were watching Linus do it in real time. We were like, well, I mean, I remember when there wasn't a Linux and then there was, and, we built one and it worked and now it runs the world and we were there. But if you come in later, right, you look at it and it's like, oh, that's so complicated. There's all this stuff inside of it. I can't understand it. And you're like, well, but you can, but you have to be willing to go there. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
This was actually one of the really interesting things when I was talking to people. Is a lot of people started with complexity.
Mm-hmm.
And then what it became clear, and I don't even think we've identified all of it, is that there was a lot of different complexities.
Yes.
And that part of what made it hard is that everyone wanted to say complexity. And then you're like, well, what complexity?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it was the complexity of the expectations of the, what does a great experience these days look like? It's the Audi versus the Ford. And sometimes it was the complexity of the amount of things you had to know, the amount of choices that are available these days. It was it is Vercel is simpler than Apache, but Apache was
Unquestionable.
literally the only thing you had to learn for a decade. So where
So trade-offs.
trade-off, but also the amount of choices you have to make just changes. So there's aspirations, there's the rate of choices, but then I also think there are the complexities that we did to ourselves, and that was really interesting when we start digging into it. So there's partially it's the aspirations. Hey, great service systems are built in React. You're like, okay, that's a lot of code that you're bringing in to do that marketing page, or that hello world. But you're like, but this is normal. And this is your point, Adam, like, because so many people have entered this industry in the last 10 years, they don't have any of that. Like, I could do it my own way. I could do it something different. There's this sense that it comes as a sealed or fully integrated system that is correct. And I think that may be the other thing that we lost a little bit along the way, is this idea of like, none of us know how to build this stuff. We're all making it up. We are not close to the sort of like, the best. Like, this is not near the peak of software development practices yet. We're not close. And then I think the other real complexity that we did to ourselves is the size of teams these days. It's not like there were never large software development teams. Goodbye, Adam. Well, maybe he'll come back by the time I stop monologuing. But the size of software development teams these days just makes everything incredibly difficult. More people, more problems.
Yeah.
I don't.
For those following along at home, we have lost Adam's stream, but we will. We'll try to come back to Adam as soon as we can. But the thing.
The Volkswagen group got him. He was talking about Audis, right? And they just. Yeah.
We can we can cut a little bit of this, but I'll tell you where I want to go next. And there, we have an Adam back.
No, I don't see an Adam yet. There he is. Woo!
Adam. And Margot got kicked out too, Adam. But you missed the tail end of a monologue from Kellan, but it was about team complexity. Kellan, a thing I'm hearing from both of you is around this sort of, you mentioned it earlier, Kellan, generational change. I want to shift gears a tiny little bit, though I think it very much comes back together. Something that both of you have been identified with in your career, and it wasn't something until I was sort of doing the research for this, is empathy in our human systems, right? Where we did not, I think it's fair to say that when the three of us came into the industry, because we're all of sort of that similar generation, empathy was not a thing. At least it wasn't an express value that we talked about in our human systems, right?
Yeah,
like it happened. I know I had many empathetic conversations with coworkers at that time.
Absolutely.
But it wasn't something that we were like explicit, like, hey, you should be empathetic. Like, it sort of happened incidentally, right? And both of you in different ways have talked about that. Adam, for you with Hug Ops, and Kellan, you're highly associated with the blameless postmortems movement in this space. What do you think? I mean, do we need, in some ways, literally those are some of the most successful cultural change movements we've had in this space over the past 15, 20 years, I think, right? I don't think it's just puffing you up to say that. I think those are real deep changes in our culture. Kudos.
We didn't create them.
Yeah, right. But like, you were,
and we certainly weren't alone.
Well, there's no, the most successful cultural change movements, it's never one person.
Yeah, of course. That's why they're a movement and not just a thing. But I'm just
exactly.
I just wanted to point out that neither I nor Kellan, I think, were the inventors of those things. We do talk about them a lot and believe in them deeply. But
I thank you for clarifying.
Merely shepherds.
Indeed.
Right.
Yes.
And I think, and there's something to that that I think is very important, especially in this moment, right, of crisis and complexity. Like, do we need even more of that, or is there a different set of cultural rules and needs that we have right now in this moment, right? I
Yeah.
mean, what?
I think I feel like there's a couple different vectors we could go down, and maybe we should explore all of them. But, one of them is we know what makes for high performing teams. And, Kellan said this earlier, that like people are unimpressed with their engineering teams. And I've done a ton of thinking about this myself, because I run a company and I want to be great. I don't just want to be, I already know that I could build a thing that was really great, but I can be better. You know what I mean? Like I want to be really, really good at it. And I think there's so much evidence, between sociological studies and just anecdotal evidence in your life, about what makes high performing teams be high performing. And it does tend to start with things like trust and safety and alignment and autonomy. And you can kind of come down this list, and when those things exist, teams can perform. And I feel like a lot of what has happened for us has been that we've also decided that software was a factory. And that the goal of that, because it's a factory, our goal is the optimization of the factory floor. So this is like the Goldratt's book, which is amazing and everyone should read it. And also, I think it leads us to a bad destination in many ways. And the reason is because it's not, if you look at the truly high performing software teams, they didn't work like factories. They worked like sports teams. They worked like athletes. These were highly trained people working hard at their craft, who were building good practices for themselves. They were learning how to spread those practices with each other. They were trying hard every day. Sometimes they failed. Other days they had great days and were wildly successful. They learned from their mistakes. They became closer together. They worked harder together, and the score took care of itself. And instead, we've decided that what we're really doing is trying to optimize this factory for consistent delivery. We've said what makes a good team isn't that they're continually getting better and winning more often than they lose. Instead, it's the lack of loss. We're saying high performing teams are teams that never lose. And they never lose because they deliver everything they say they'll do in the time frame they say they'll do it, in the way they say they'll do it. And because that's what makes an efficient factory, right? If we produce 100 widgets at a time and the 100 widgets come out at a constant rate and the factory never breaks, then that is a good and efficient factory. And that's not actually how software gets built. It's not how teams work. It's not what makes them perform the best. It's none of those things. And we've just misapplied those techniques to our domain, to our detriment.
I'm going to yes and you, Adam. So
Please
I
do.
totally agree. I've always loved the sports team analogy. I also like the idea of an orchestra. I think that exactly what you say. This software is this collective creative enterprise. And you're absolutely right. The thing that makes great teams are the fact that they are a team, and they are a healthy team, and there's safety, and people are watching out for each other, and they are interacting and engaging and improving their craft. I think all those things are really true. I think that there's some interesting other elements.
Mm-hmm.
We've known this for a long time. I mean, and our industry has a slavish devotion to being like, well, if Google did it, it must be right.
Yeah.
And yet somehow even Google research of, hey, it's about high trust teams. They can't even follow their own research, much less the rest of us following it. And so why is that? What's going on there? And there's a few things I think going on. And the first thing is, I think, to your question, Lewis, is about is there enough empathy? I think we've hit a barrier on empathy in a couple of interesting ways. And one of the real barriers is I just don't think it's natural for most people to think about the team versus the individual.
Totally.
And software is just not built by individuals anymore. It is not the nature of the domain. This is one of the things that
I don't think it ever was.
Yeah, Stallman?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so.
Yeah,
I think
but I
like,
think it's
yeah.
even
Well,
less
I mean,
true.
we did like to pretend that it was,
We
right?
absolutely pretended it was.
It is even less true though, because I mean, I remember an era where you put your headphones on and you typed code, and like a month later you checked it into RCS, and like
Totally.
it
Me
was a
too.
little bit like building software by yourself.
A little.
And it's so different than what we do now, where you're actually like, it's an orchestra and everyone has to be playing in time, or it just sounds awful.
Yes.
So I think that's one of the real challenges, is like there is a whole hurdle where each
Absolutely.
set of people, like, I don't know if it's inherent human nature or if it's just capitalism has broken us or like something, but like we think of ourselves as individuals, or it's just being Americans. I don't know. So I think that's one of the challenges. I think the other interesting challenge, and you said something about it, Adam, and I've already lost it, but one of the other pieces of this is we say, okay, so like we have a tendency to blame this breakdown on the bosses or on the leads, but like there's also parts of this breakdown that comes from the bottoms up.
Totally.
You know, part of that breakdown in empathy is also the empathy has to go both ways. Like there has to be trust in leadership and management, and like this job sucks and no one cares about my feelings because, well, you know, I'm paid a lot more
Totally.
than you. So, but like I get it, but like that's part of it. But then
That's
the other
very
piece
easy
is,
to see
yeah,
on Twitter
yeah,
with
yeah,
people how they feel about venture capitalists.
yeah, yep.
Like it's the easiest thing in the universe to just be like, fuck a venture capitalist, and all they do is fuck the whole world up while you're
Yeah.
talking, while you're just covered in venture capital gear. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Anyway, keep going.
And then the other piece of it that I think is interesting, and I'm still there was going to be at least a fourth installment of my series, and I kind of petered out because I'm not entirely sure how I want to write this. One of the other things that changed in this process is that it wasn't just the bosses, the CEOs who thought software was easy. Somehow the narrative that software is easy got into the mainstream. The idea that this should be an easy, low-key job where we go to the gym and eat yogurt parfait. And the idea that work should never be uncomfortable, that hard things should never be uncomfortable, that growth should never be uncomfortable, has also landed in this. And so it's hard to know, is there another step of empathy? Because, I mean, the idea that, you know, that empathy movement was partially away from like the bastard operator from hell moment where like work sucked all the time and people screamed at you, and empathy was a really important tool there. That is not the operating environment right now for most people in software, even while it is still toxic.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because there's something inside there about the fact that like when we're building these teams and we're thinking about why these things matter, it just like with the tooling or anything else, people actually don't really know why we do those things.
Yeah.
So like we don't like we didn't give you yogurt parfait for free because yogurt parfait was better. It on some like in some like platonic form kind of way. It's not like there was we did it because the people who were doing the work had to commute to these huge offices so that the orchestra could be conducted together. And that commute often started too early to have breakfast. And so if we put breakfast at the place where you went to work, then it was easier to get there. And then if people didn't have breakfast, then the 5 hours of meetings they needed to do to conduct the orchestra correctly didn't work as well because they were all grumpy and tired, because if you don't eat breakfast, you're grumpy and tired. So we put breakfast there. But most people didn't think about it that way. They just thought about it as, oh, the perk was I got breakfast. And so now you come in and like the expectation is breakfast. And you're like, but no, wait a second. We were doing breakfast because breakfast was the thing we needed to have in order to get to the outcomes we desired. And therefore, breakfast is a good thing for the business. But there's nothing inherent about delivering breakfast to software developers, right? It's not like software development requires free breakfast. That's insane. And there's definitely a little of that happening where people are like, oh no, obviously as a software developer, I'm entitled to free breakfast. And you're like, wait, no, why? Like maybe, But
I love the fact that you drew the parallelism with the technical stuff. People don't understand why we made the technical choices, and they don't understand why we serve breakfast.
It's
I think
the
that's
exact
exactly it.
It's the exact same thing. And there are people who remember because we decided we should put breakfast in the office.
Yeah.
And we were like, oh, why is that hard? We're like, well, because we have 20,000 people who commute to the campus every day. And, you know, it's like, why was there, not to lean too much on Facebook, but it blew my mind. Like, they had a really good Mexican restaurant at the campus in Facebook. And it was just there. And there was like good coffee across the little way from it. And there was like a little golden path with the like a Wizard of Oz kind of thing in the middle of it. It was fucking
That's
nuts.
a little on the nose.
I know. If the Wicked Witch was dead, it was crazy, right? But like it was awesome. And you like it made you want to hang out there. And the reason that was true is because there were like a lot of people there. You know, like it wasn't like a couple people, it was like a lot of people, and we all had to be there, and so we better give them something to do, because otherwise they're in this like soulless hellscape, and that's no fun, and that makes the teams not perform well, and people don't like to be in soulless hellscapes, and blah 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 blah. But like it's the same problem, which is once it's become a rule, the rule is, as a high valued software developer, I get breakfast. Now,
so I think the other interesting place where it has started to break down, again, this is the stuff that I was going to write in the 4th installment and just like, this feels insensitive at the moment. So the other thing
you should definitely say it on a podcast. Don't worry.
I should definitely say it on a podcast. No one's going to listen. Yeah, exactly.
It's definitely better if you say the insensitive thing out loud, Kellan.
I try. So the other thing that worked when we were leaning into empathy and leading into high trust, values aligned teams, is we had relationships with those people. They lasted. And so the other thing that changed in the last 10 years was in San Francisco, average tenure for a software engineer was 18 months.
Right.
And again, this is not a thing that can be solved top down. Like, you know, we had all of these practices that were predicated on the idea that we were building a team that learned to play together over many years and got better over time. And then we removed the idea that we were actually going to have that time to get better together.
Because they were factories.
Yeah.
Why do I care if someone leaves in 18 months? I can replace them. It's a factory.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, I mean,
and I am a cog, or I am a cog in a factory. Therefore, I should just move to the highest paying factory, which good on you. Get paid. I'm not arguing don't get paid. Definitely get paid. Get the money.
Get paid.
But but it's because we don't actually treat each other like the highly skilled professionals that we actually are. And we definitely don't manage and train to them. And so the tenure is lower.
And the tenure is lower, which makes it harder, which pushes us towards, and again, we don't ever go back and be like, okay, so why do we do blameless postmortems? You know?
Right. Or do people now doing, lots of people I've seen do blameless postmortems where they're doing the rituals of blameless postmortems and blaming the crap out of each other. Because the shape of blameless postmortem has sunk into the zeitgeist. That is the way we run postmortems.
And then none of that benefit of building trust and learning in the feedback cycle ever arrives.
Yeah, this is why people don't like Scrum. If we were the guys who invented
Scrum is just bad.
I know, but if it wouldn't have been bad if we were the people who invented Scrum. I bet when you do Scrum with those guys, it's a delight.
Yeah.
I bet Scrum's the greatest thing you've ever done when you do it with the dudes who wrote the Scrum manifesto. I bet it's incredible. But like, that's not what we had. We had the like 8th order effects of Scrum that were like, only the product owner can run, you know? You're like,
oh man. I mean, that's something that I beat my head against here at Tidelift on a semi-regular basis, right? Is this, when we all got into open source in various ways, I mean, part of what makes open source amazing, and in a previous episode, we literally talked about the theme of joy in open source.
Yeah.
But so much of that derives from the human, right? And our norm in open source now is, oh, hey, we just use this package manager, and like you've abstracted away, you've used the like undoubtedly useful, powerful, incredible abstraction of the package that completely abstracts away the people on the other side of that thing. And you end up in these conversations that are like, well, I did the open source and you're like, okay, but open source, is it people? Is it a, is it npm? And things start getting very fuzzy and very, I think, Adam, to your point, it suddenly becomes
I'm a
the companion to factory
Yeah.
is that it's
Open-
infrastructure.
Yeah, and
Nobody
open
likes
source
their
is
bridges.
open source is a perfect example of this. What does it take in the modern era for most people to believe they've open sourced something? And the answer is they made it public on GitHub. And that's not what it means to me, and it's not what it means to you, and it's not what it means to Kellan, but that's because we're old people. And what it means to them is that they clicked the button on GitHub and it was public, and therefore it's open source. And it's okay that that's how that's evolved. It's all right that's sort of the way that it is. But under the hood there is this struggle around how do we align our the values that mattered in that experience and in that movement, and impart that to people who are going to create another different new movement that may be an extension of the existing movement of open source. Maybe it's an extension of the existing way we manage software development teams. Maybe it's an existing way of the way we think about structuring companies, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's something completely different. And in the same way that those like old guys at the knock did have interesting things to say about how we could build monitoring systems that worked better for safety critical systems, right? Because that's what they were telling me. They were like, you can't run an ISP this way. Like, what if it fails? And I'm like, well, it's not a nuclear power plant, so it's probably okay. And whereas for them, if it failed, it's like not okay. People die. It's bad news. And so I think there's a part of what needs to happen here is this recognition that the task at hand is partly to help that generation of people understand that they can just create the world they want, that's all that we ever did. And right now it feels like it was this pre-existing, that there's so much prior art and so much pre-existing layers and so much complicated stuff that you could never just invent something or just do it because you wanted to, or do it because it was fun, or maybe just do it because it's art. Like, I think software is art always. And like, that's why I like it. And sometimes I'm doing it because I want it. And like System Initiative is this big, complicated thing. We're going to bring it into the world. I love the crap out of it. I have no idea if other people will. Not really, but I don't care. I love it. It's the album I wanted to make. It's the song I wanted to sing. And like,
I mean, you
just got to put it out into the world. And I think it's the same thing kind of across the board here, where if you look at like, why is the CEO upset that their team, to Kellan's earlier supposition, like, why do they not feel good about their software teams? Well, fundamentally, it's because their expectations are misaligned about what the software teams are. And also, the software teams have an unaligned expectation about what their CEOs want and don't want. And that lack of alignment leads to a natural lack of autonomy. And when we have a lack of alignment, then we tug on people to try and get them back into alignment. And if we're over here doing work and we feel like our leadership aren't aligned to the work that we're doing, then we feel like they don't understand us and they don't care about us and none of those things matter. And fundamentally, that's because we've over and over and over again forgotten that those things are actually in our control. Anyway, not to rant too much.
Oh, no. I mean, well, we're all, I mean, it's such a, I mean, none of these things are technical questions that have short answers, right? I'm not asking you. I'm asking, I'm giving
You're
you
asking ranty questions.
Yeah, right. We could all monologue on these things for a long time.
Yeah.
So no apologies.
I hate to undermine it's the album I wanted to make because that spoke to my soul. But there was another point you made in there that I want to go back to, which is the idea that people don't realize they can invent their own world.
Yeah.
And it's really funny when, I just, I tell people things like, I had been writing software for 3 years and getting paid to do it before I used source control. I had been writing software for 12 years before I worked with my first PM. I was probably 9 years before I'd ever used a bug tracker. Like, these things are just like,
right.
They happen. Like, now you go in and you're like, well, software is done this way and we've got
obviously you have to have a bug tracker.
I mean, because where else do you keep the prioritized backlog? And I'm like, I don't even really know quite what a prioritized backlog is, but I'm going to pretend that I do because
I've deleted
I'm supposed
it.
to know how to build software. So,
Yeah.
But for well over half of my career, we didn't have these things.
Right.
Source control was unequivocally good. That was good. The rest of it we can talk about, but source control, solid.
But even then, I think we've probably gone overboard with source control.
Yeah, probably.
Like, to be honest, like there's a bunch of systems that we build right now. Infrastructure as code's a good one. It's, let's be blunt, a lot of the problems in the user experience that come from doing infrastructure as code come from source control. Yeah. Like, we're checking the theoretical code that builds the state for the end thing in an API into source control because we're pretending it's a right reflection of what happened in the messy cloud provider we called through a SaaS API, and that belonged in source control, so we could put it into a continuous delivery pipeline. We basically said we wanted a fighter jet and built a submarine and then congratulated ourselves on how smart we were. It's insane. And like, I get it because I was there and I really advocated for it a lot.
Yeah.
And like, just so we're clear, I did this. I brought this unto you. I built the submarine and was like, this submarine's a fighter jet. And like, it wasn't a fighter jet. It was a submarine. And what a bummer to realize you did that. But my point is, we don't have to live that way. We can just change our minds.
New rule: all guests over the age of 40 have to deliver at least one mea culpa per episode. That's the
at least one apology for what they've wrought.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry,
cloud.
I didn't
so
know.
Sorry about the tag clouds.
Tag clouds were a good idea at the time. They really were.
Man. Yeah, tag cloud.
Love a good tag cloud.
They did morph into hashtags, and so now we see them on billboards. So that
what's your apology though?
Mine?
Yeah.
Oh man. Well, actually, it has a lot to do with what you two have just been talking about, which is I am the enforcement arm of the open source, the legalist arm of open source, right? I get called in to say, like, you have written the license that is outside of the bounds of the rules.
Yeah.
And I'm going to wag my finger at you extremely vigorously. And and I'm increasingly questioning that, right? I mean, I don't, I think that open as played by this box, right, has allowed a lot of innovation at other layers of the stack. Right?
Totally.
We constrained one layer, and that allowed us to do a lot of really cool things in other layers of the stack, which is great. But I see these sort of next. I mean, I especially see this in machine learning right now. There's a lot of, is this open? And to which I just want to scream, who cares? Like, go do the thing. Yeah. And then we'll figure out. And so I am certainly doing, I think, a bit of professional repentance right now of trying to figure out how we, how to transmit the lessons that we learned that are the right lessons, how to not be a stickler about the wrong lessons, and how to tell the difference between those two, right? Because it's very easy to come in and say, like, look, we learned it this way. We have the scars to prove it. Here they are. Please don't do this.
Well, and most people it's really easy to terrify normal people by being a lawyer.
Oh, yeah.
So it's an extremely powerful position to wag your finger from. Do you know what I mean? Like it's not like a normal person wagging their finger. It's like, oh, the lawyer's wagging their finger at me. Like, I better.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Better pay attention, which is good advice in general. If a lawyer wags their finger at you, you should listen. And also,
though, I mean, I think it's,
but not always.
Not always. And the open source legal community is, to its credit, mostly people who are sort of on the weird edge of lawyering, right?
Totally.
Like, if you're an intellectual property lawyer and you're like, intellectual property works really well, if you like are on the boring, straight and narrow of being an intellectual property lawyer, open source law is not your thing, right? Totally, so we tend to attract. But at the same time, we're all very risk averse. Yeah. And we get into this situation where we're like, well, look, these rules that made sense 25 years ago when they were handed down to us on stone tablets I mean, we tell the story that the open source initiative handed them down on stone tablets, but actually Debian handed them down on stone tablets,
Right. And then we
and things were
rewrote
lost in
them.
translation.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we rewrote them, but we didn't rewrite them enough.
Yeah,
And
totally.
the younger generations, we have this bad habit of saying, no, don't do
You
it
don't
this way.
understand.
You don't understand. And like sometimes that's right? Like sometimes,
Yeah.
in fact, there is a correct lesson to be passed along. And I think that's one of the things that is, I suspect both of you, I struggle with, I suspect both of you struggle with. How do you identify which of the lessons you actually do want to pass down and which ones you're like, actually that one doesn't apply anymore, or I'm not sure, so let me couch it, because sometimes you just want to save people pain.
I think about it as there's this idea of like of this concept of shuhari, which is essentially like how it's basically just a way to talk about how you learn things and how people master things. And in the first stage, we learn things by doing what we're told the way we're told to do them very accurately. So, this is the way it is. Do it this way, and the outputs will be the way you expect, right? That's how it works when you're learning anything. You're learning to write, and you're like, okay, well, make an A. And you're like, oh, that's a sloppy A. Okay, make the A less sloppy, And if we sort of do that for a while, it's good. And then we get to a stage where we've exceeded. We don't need to do that anymore because we've got that part down enough. We've worked the system or the process enough that we can just do it without thinking. And at that point, we start to riff a little, right? We start to like, well, but my A, like now I have a style of A that isn't like what was in the book. It's like how I make A's, and that works for me because the way I hold my hand or the way this thing happens, and so it becomes more unique to you, and it becomes more expressive of your own point of view and your own experience mixed in with the mastery of the basics. And then you get to the last step, which is basically transcending the rules of the original system because you have now recognized the limitations it puts upon you, and you're inventing another one. So now we're in the part where we're going to create a new way of working or a new way of being or a new way of thinking or a new thing we're doing, and we're going to take from our experience what we need, and we're going to take what we learned in that part where we were riffing, and now we're going to create something that's altogether different or new. And we're at this moment where there's enough of the first part. There's so many things in the world you have to do that learning curve to get to a spot where you feel like you have mastery is really high.
Yeah.
And then when people start to riff at all, we wag our finger. We're like, hey, don't riff. No riffing. Riffing is bad. No riffing. Again, software factories, consistency. This is probably controversial, but like I feel this way every time somebody wags their finger at me about how Python works. I'm like, why does Python work that way? And they go, because that's how Python works, and it works that only one way. And I'm like, yeah, but isn't that a dumb way? And they're like, no. And I'm like, why not? And they're like, because it's Python. And I'm like, okay, that is an unsatisfactory answer on every level, but fine. I have the same problem with the boring technology movement. I'm like, I know Kellan, I think, has a different point of view about boring technology, but
I think I might be the patron saint of
boring technology, right?
Yep.
But it always feels very finger waggy to me. And so I think part of what needs to happen in order for us to get past all of this and to sort of get people re-engaged in and feel better about what's happening and have better outcomes is to actually give each other a little more grace to stop finger wagging and start saying, well, I don't know. Maybe it would be better to write a license that means I can't be exploited if I work long hours in China. And maybe that should be a thing that we think is a good thing because as people, we think that's good and right. And maybe I don't care that it's not open source by the definition we came up with 20 years ago when that wasn't a problem and we didn't understand those things. But maybe I still want them in my club,
Right. Well, and that's where we get back to these questions of who's in the factory, who owns the factory, who provides the capital. I mean, but that's a whole nother podcast.
But the people who provide the capital don't care. What they care about is a return on their capital. You don't, no, for real. if you're winning, if you take money from venture capitalists and then you build a company and it works and you're winning, whatever you're doing, they're like, you're a genius, keep doing that. And it doesn't
I totally
matter.
agree
They
with Adam
don't
on
care.
this. I actually, this goes back to the point of like why we are having this crisis now, is that winning got harder.
Winning got harder. And exactly. When everybody was winning, it's all easy. It's like you're standing at a craps table. We're all up. But like, I don't know if anybody plays craps. This is probably a terrible analogy, but I love craps. And one of the first times I learned to play craps, I was stuck building a data center in Las Vegas. And so I spent my time learning to play craps because I had to do something because I was miserable that I was stuck there. And I was one of those people who hated Las Vegas. And I was like, I can't stay here and hate this place for this long. Like I have to like find a way to love it. And so I did. And so I was playing, I was like day 3 of learning how to play craps. And we had this, it was late and we're at the MGM Grand. I swear the story will end. And there was this woman from very, very wealthy. She was wearing like a beautiful white dress. She's probably 70. And she was wearing like a white dress and she was covered in jewels and diamonds. And I was playing like very conservative craps. I was like just pass line and odds, best bet in the casino, really straightforward. This woman was throwing money at all sorts of crazy. She was like, the dice are going to come up 8s the hard way, which is just 4s, right? And she would just put she would put $10,000 on the hard ways, right? And so this whole table was winning, but she probably lost 200 grand in like 20 minutes. But when the table turned, everybody left. You know, eventually the table turns on you, winning gets harder. The analogy's lost, I can tell. But the point is,
Adam.
I know, but the point is that like that when it turns, it does get harder. And when it gets harder, that's when the scrutiny arrives. And it's not because it was right before and bad now. It was wrong then too. It just didn't matter because the strength of your winning overcome it. A pithy way to say it is that winning buys culture. Have whatever culture you want if you're winning. Are you losing? Every motherfucker's going to have an opinion about your culture.
Well, we're running short on time here.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that one of the things you guys are optimistic about, right? We've spent 45 minutes talking about crisis and negativity. Is there anything? I mean, Adam, you've got a thing you're obviously very excited about. Feel free to use this time to talk about System Initiative, or if there's other things in the industry or the tools or the culture that you're excited about.
I mean, look, I'm optimistic about the whole thing. I actually really believe that we can change the way that we relate to how we build these things and the way we relate to these people by talking about them as teams, by talking about them more as the professionals that we are who have to collaborate together, because those things create better outcomes. Those things aren't right on their own. That's how you win. And so in an environment where winning is scarce, the winners are the ones who do that best, which will then cause other people to look at them and go, what are they doing? And the answer is working hard together as teams, learning and growing in high trust environments with high safety and tight alignment between leadership and execution. And because that's what winning does. That's how you win. That's always how you win. It was how you won. It's how we won when Caesar conquered the Gauls. And it's how you win now building software. It was a weird analogy. Like I went from craps to Caesar, but like,
it's fine.
But that's I'm optimistic because that's what's going to happen. And the folks who are really bad at it are going to lose, because that's what happens.
And that actually, I think is that second part, 100% what Adam said. I'm actually also really optimistic. You know, one of the things going around looking at it was realizing that in many ways we are much better at this than we used to be. Mm-hmm. And it's just that winning got harder. It's also that we failed to teach the next generation, but mostly it's that winning got harder. And also there was a period when no one was keeping score. And so you could lie about whether or not you were winning. And a lot of bad shit happened during that period. And now we're keeping score again. And I actually think it's a really powerful time to get better at building software, because I think it matters how we build software, because software is so impactful in the world. And the values that you bring to building software get manifested in how that software impacts the world. And so
100%.
I actually think we are in a unique opportunity to move those values forward again. I'm really excited about it.
In a way that we could not before, because before you could hide under just everybody was winning. And and it sucks that that's that way but also I think it's necessary. And I think it also is going to allow that next wave of change, because the people who can do that and can teach other people to do it and can then bring those things into the world, they will build the tools that will change the behavior of people who don't understand as much how to do it from scratch. And that's the thing about using tools, is that they create your culture. Like the culture is the expression of what you do. It's not what you say, it's what you do. And so if you can find things that were built the way Kellan just described by those teams that are high performing, the software then tends to reinforce the behaviors that led to high performance. They can't do all of it because some of it's human and it's not the thing, but it can help. And once it starts, it compounds because the other decisions become more obvious.
Yeah. I mean, I want to, again, we could do a whole nother podcast, and indeed I had hoped to get into it, but it's just the other conversation about this relationship of tools and culture, because I do think, we touched on it a little bit, right, by talking about revision control and how we don't have, how when you have the revision control hammer and everything is a nail, it does impact how you collaborate. But
here's one. Well, actually, I feel like if we're going to talk about tools and culture, I can't let this go without saying this.
Do it.
GitHub is built for open source, and it's built for open source by a person who didn't like his contributors very much. Well, by a person who didn't like his contributors very much, and GitHub takes that and it puts at the heart of all of our software teams a deep distrust and hatred of our coworkers. Yeah. It is a terrible, terrible tool that breaks us down as people who trust each other and want to work together.
Amen.
Wow. Well, that is a
right next to backlogs.
Right next to backlogs.
It's right next to backlogs in terms of the toxic shit we do to each other.
Oh boy, Jamie Zawinski called me a attention deficit teenager once because I deleted a backlog. That is a story for another day. It's been awesome having you both. We will definitely do this again sometime.
Thank you.
And best of luck to you, Kellan, in your new role. And Adam, whenever your launch comes, I hope it's an awesome and successful one. I have no doubt it will be. So thank you both.
Thanks so much. This was fun.
So fun.